Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I have with me today Dr. Barry Duncan, the co-developer of the ORS and SRS and the founder of the Heart and Soul project. And I also have with me Cindy Hansen, the vice president of My Outcomes. We are very excited today to announce that 11.0 will be released on May 18th. And today's objective of our meeting is to introduce what we're doing and some of the new features. So Cindy, welcome with us, and welcome Dr. Barry Duncan.
Thank you, Vic. And I just wanted to say how excited I am to share version 11 with you. We have incorporated a lot of your ideas, some of our own, some of Barry's, and we hope that you will be pleasantly surprised and pleased with what you're about to see. So to begin with, you may ask yourself, how can anything be better than the current My Outcomes version? Well, for starters, its appearance. The new version will have a cleaner and crisper look that makes it far more visually appealing. The sleeker look of the new version creates an ease of accessing information that the older version just didn't have. Besides streamlining processes and providing advanced graphing and reporting functions, version 11 also includes an update to the trajectory of change calculations. Barry Duncan is going to explain more about this development and the new algorithms and feedback messages in a few minutes. Just one important note that with the changes to the calculations, we've also came up with a new term. Trajectory of change that you're familiar with has been renamed Expected Treatment Response, or ERT. So to begin with, I'm going to walk you through the main changes we have made to the way you use the system. Then when Barry and I have finished our presentations, we will be answering your questions. So please add your questions as they come up to the question box located on your GoToWebinar control panel. So here is the new home page, which are now more intuitive and friendly for all users. All of the functions that once were only available by right-clicking on the tree directory are now only one click away, or touch if you're on a touch screen. The new dashboard also allows for mass transfers of providers from one supervisor to another, for example. And the provider home screen has been redesigned to include a list of clients with quick access to the next ORS or SRS that is to be completed, as well as a color-coded icon for the expected treatment response. The color represents the last ORS feedback signal color, so red, green, or yellow. And to better accommodate couples, we have created a separate dashboard for them. With the need to right-click eliminated, My Outcomes is now fully accessible on mobile devices. All functions can be performed with a standard click or a screen touch. In addition, version 11 has been optimized for iPad and Android tablets. Besides supporting the iPad and Android browsers, My Outcomes version 11 also supports Internet Explorer 9 and 10, Firefox, Google Chrome, and Safari's latest versions. So let's get back to the new features. The old graphs are gone and have been replaced with the new interactive graphs. The expected treatment response graphs replace the old trajectory of change graphs and display both ORS and SRS scores simultaneously. If you roll over a data point on the live graph, you will also get a pop-up that contains the score and the session date. By clicking on the titles and the legends, you can remove different layers to help simplify what you see. In this image, I have removed the graph background colors. In this image, I've also removed the SRS cutoff line and data points. At the bottom of the graphs, You can now update session scores and compare up to 4 sets of subscale scores. Feedback sources, in this case, mommy and sibling, can also be seen on same ORS or SRS client graph. And if you want to export your raw data as a CSV or Excel file, we have now added extra columns to identify whether the ORS or CORS were used, the client's month and year of birth, gender, and the session dates for the ORS SRS scores. We have also tried to simplify the language we use to describe your aggregate statistics and added pop-ups right on the screen to create greater clarity. When you go to administer the scales, they will now show in full screen with the tree view automatically hidden. And last but not least, to meet the needs of our global client base, the ORS, CORS, SRS, CSRS in version 11 is now available in 20 different languages. Thank you, and over to you, Barry Duncan.
Hello, everyone. Hey, I'm very excited about all these changes, and I love the new look, and I love the additional options. I really like being able to having the graph be interactive because I don't like clutter, and so I would want to see the graph in its purest form, ORS, and without the SRS, and I think I could make a better visual for the client that way. But people have different tastes, so it's really good that it can be exactly how you want it to look when you're working with your clients. So I want to take it, to the science here a bit about, what backs up the system that My Outcomes has so nicely produced and is able to present the science of PCOMS, the Partners for Change Outcome Management System, in a way that's so user-friendly. So I want to give you a little background about that. As always, I like to remind people about the website, because the website, heartandsoulofchange.com, has over 250 free downloads about everything that you want to know about PCOMS, including webinars and all kinds of different stuff about implementation, just lots of things that you can learn about how to implement the Partners for Change Outcome Management System. How sweet it is! And of course, it is an evidence-based practice now, designated by SAMHSA on the National Registry of Evidence-Based Practices and Programs, and this evidence-based practice is what My Outcomes has devised a web-based system to do.
We're on a mission from God.
And, in many respects, I see My Outcomes as a way to continue our primary mission, which has been to privilege a client's voice in all services that they receive and allow them to be full partners in all decisions that affect their care. And finally, the website, as well as myoutcomes.com, allows you to relate to and interface with many other people who are using these ideas and talking about them. And there are many ways to join the community at the Heart and Soul of Change project as well. So, funders, oh my gosh. The fact that PCOMS and what My Outcomes delivers is an evidence-based practice is huge for a lot of reasons, because first of all, that's what funders want, whether it's a public or a private funder. Now, by my picture here, I'm not really trying to demonize funders.
They should die like pigs in hell.
But really, this is kind of what they're after. But we've had our hands tied lately, because for the last 15 years actually, because having an evidence-based practice for each specific client population or disorder is absolutely ridiculous to even think about. There's 150 evidence-based practices now, and there's over 400 different diagnoses, so you do the math, there's no way we can learn all that. And the other thing that they want is return on investment and proof of value, those kind of business terms. And let's give them their due. They have reason for their concern, because treatment variability, therapist variability, and dropout have been big cost items as well as big effectiveness drains. So they're demanding that outcomes be measured. But we have a problem there too, in that most outcome measures are just not feasible for everyday clinical practice. Who wants to fill out a 30 or 45 item form to get feedback and know whether or not you're measuring your outcomes and you're getting good outcomes? And of course, that's where PCOMS comes in. It is a SAMHSA evidence-based practice, but it's quite different. First of all, it's atheoretical and therefore additive to any theoretical orientation. It doesn't change the way you work. It only makes the way you work better. And secondly, it can be applied to clients of all diagnostic categories. So it's very different in that regard. And regarding feasibility, it only takes 5 minutes to do this. Clients do it in a minute, and our whole process only takes 5 minutes. You know, there have been times that it's taken 10 minutes in a session, but most time it's under 5 minutes because it's clinically meaningful and housed within the session, not outside of it. It incorporates the most robust predictors of ultimate treatment outcome. I'll talk a lot about the first one, which is clients' view of their early change. Their subjective experience of early change is the most robust predictor of outcome we have going. That's what the ORS does. It measures early change, records it so we can identify those clients who aren't responding so we can do something different with them. You know, it also measures the other robust predictor, and that's the therapeutic alliance, that tried and true but taken for granted old friend. So it measures those two aspects that predict outcome, but it does it in a way that partners with clients and honors the daily pressures of frontline clinicians. You know, and by the way, this NREP process was quite an arduous one, and it was what allowed that to happen was 3 randomized clinical trials that were conducted by the partners of the Heart and Soul of Change project. Here they are. They're all on the website if you want to download them. By the way, there's 3 more in various completions. We just submitted the group randomized clinical trial, which shows that it's effective in group treatment. There's another group treatment RCT going to be completed by the end of the summer. We're going to submit the huge RCT with kids during the summer, so we keep rolling these out, and that will also allow it to be a specific evidence-based treatment practice with kids as well. So all of this, My Outcomes has taken all of this information and put it in a web-based system that allows you to not only administer and score, but also aggregate the data and be able to address return on investment and also be able to address funders' need for evidence-based practices. So I love this quote by Ralph Waldo Emerson. I don't know if you have seen this before, but I like it and I've used it for a long time. If a man will kick a fact out of the window, when he comes back, he finds it again in the chimney corner. So let's look at the facts about early change and the usual course or trajectory of change in psychotherapy. And I just froze up here. Sorry about that. Let me quickly do this. You know, I've been interested in this early change phenomenon for, you know, a long time, and, you know, it really struck me from the very beginning from Ken Howard's work in 1986, believe it or not. Ken Howard was the first one to look at trajectories of change in psychotherapy, and here is what he found. Now, if you look at this graph, now again, way back in 1986, the first 6 to 8 sessions accounted for most of the change that was going to happen in psychotherapy. Now that dotted line is client perspective, and you see that most change happens in that first 6 to 8 sessions, regardless of how long. And if it goes on for 104 sessions there, that was survivor analysis, by the way, not real clients, but nevertheless, if it goes on that far, you see that there is additional change, but it's a course of diminishing returns. In other words, it takes a lot more therapy to realize gain. If we look more recently at studies, and even studies that didn't even look at the trajectory of change, like you've heard me talk about the Cannabis Youth Treatment Project and Project Match, look at when change happened. It happens right away in the treatment trajectory. It doesn't flatline for 3 years, for example, in that bottom graph, and then all of a sudden the client has an epiphany and changes. In that study, Project Match, if they were going to address their drinking, they did it in the first 3 to 5 weeks of treatment. And you've heard me talk about the TDCRP, the Treatment of Depression Collaborative Research Program, same deal. Look at when the change happened in all bona fide treatments. So, you know, we have to conclude that early change is an important factor for the prediction of short and long-term outcome. No other two ways about it. And if you think about it from a clinical point of view, and that's what I do, is I apply all this to the actual work itself because I'm a clinician first, and this was a real gift. This gave me a way to identify clients who weren't responding to what I usually do so that I could talk to them about it and we could collaboratively form new directions for our therapy, right? It allows me to catch people who were on course for a negative outcome, either dropping out or not benefiting from my work. But regardless of how many times this fact of early change predicting later change and that most change happens early on in therapy is presented to people, it still rubs them the wrong way. And this fact will reappear in the chimney corner every study that you look at. Because some people look at that trajectory for 8 sessions as an indictment of long-term work, or that early change is somehow an indictment of long-term work. It's not. Please understand that it's not an indictment of long-term work. However, it is an indictment of long-term work in which clients are not benefiting. Those are two entirely different things. There's nothing wrong with long-term work as long as clients are showing benefit from that work. It's true that it takes some clients longer than others, and I'll show you the data on that shortly. But importantly, it's not for the change to start, it's for the change to plateau. So even clients that are in therapy a long time begin that change early in the treatment process, so it's equally a predictor for them if they don't experience that early bump. Here is a study that really helped me figure this stuff out and understand it better, and actually led to the percolation of these longer-term trajectories that are now in my outcomes. But this is a great study by Baldwin, and if you look at the trajectory, the top one, this is the OQ45, and when the scores go down, it means the client's getting better. Well, that is the trajectory of change you're going to see almost with any measure in any population. You see, again, the change happens in the first 6 to 8 sessions with a course of diminishing returns thereafter, right? That's typically the way it looks like. But what Baldwin did is he stratified them according to length of stay, right? So if you look at that last graph on the right, you see that it's flatter and slower for the client to achieve about the same amount of change. But when does the change start? It starts right away. So we still should be worried, even with clients who are in therapy longer, if they don't show that benefit beginning relatively early. It's just slower. It doesn't mean that it shouldn't be any change at all. It's just slower. Here's the myth, right? The myth is the clients flatline and then have an epiphany. You know what? I'm not saying that's never happened in the history of psychotherapy, but it is not clearly the way it typically occurs, or even how it occurs remotely. So the question remains, when do you start getting worried about clients when they're not benefiting? And I vote for sooner rather than later, and that's exactly what my outcomes let you know. Looking at data, again, kind of looking at, well, how many clients do go on? And, you know, really the 1 to 8 trajectories, the 8-session trajectories had a pretty good track record of covering most clients. This is 2 large data sets. UCC is a university counseling center, and PBH is a public behavioral health, you know, a mental health center, a community mental health center. And in the university counseling center, 77% of the clients 77% of the clients only attended 8 sessions or less. At the PBH, at the CMHC, the Community Mental Health Center, it was 12 sessions. So any way you slice it, the majority of clients attend therapy 8 sessions or less. So these old expected treatment response or trajectories had a pretty good track record. But still, you know, therapists who were typically saw people for longer periods of time, and you know, after a while in your caseload, if 1 in 4 of your clients wind up being longer term, more than 8 sessions, think about that. You'll turn over the ones that are 8, and after a while, you'll have a pretty big percentage of your cases that are over 8 sessions. So this still didn't fit many therapists' experience, and I really struggled with trying to figure out how to get them to pay attention to the early change phenomenon. You know, so, you know, they were still kind of put off by this. So, you know, in workshops sometimes people that were longer term, their orientation had a hard time swallowing this. But the worst part was them not killing me. The worst part was they were killing the message. And that is, it's not an indictment of long-term work. Actually, it's a way that you can use early change even if you see longer-term clients. So, I thought about that, deliberated about it, and I thought about, wow, what if we looked at trajectories for clients, that 1 in 4 clients who go more than 8 sessions? And so we took the My Outcomes database, which was 427,000 administrations of the ORS, and I collaborated with statistical whiz and University of Kentucky professor Michael Tolan and computer magician and all-around very bright guy to help me work through this stuff, Bill Wiggin. And we looked at them, and we developed an expected treatment response for 8 sessions or less and for 18 or less sessions, or that 1 in 4 people that go on. Now, why did we choose 18? Because that was 97% of that My Outcomes database. 97% of people attend 8 sessions or less. And then after that, the numbers got so small, you really couldn't do very good expected treatment responses. So the old algorithms that were in My Outcomes covered 60 to 75% of clients seen in outpatient regular settings. The new ones cover 97%. So they predict therapy outcomes based on short-term and longer-term encounters, thereby addressing the needs of longer-term clients as well as those therapists that see them. Now, that brings us to the feedback messages. I also wanted to develop a feedback message system that was more clinically savvy, not just based on the change since the last score. Again, you think about how these things unfold, and what happened with the previous messages. They were very good guides, but there were many situations that would come up, especially the longer the client was in service, that the feedback messages didn't fit as well. So what I wanted to do was bring some clinical common sense to the mix, as well as allow the feedback message to be dynamic, not only based on change since the last session, but change since the therapy began. So a person could therefore change slower, but still not get a warning signal. Rather, as long as they were achieving a % of the change of the expected treatment response, that they would still be seen, in the good category, basically. So, here's what the feedback message looks like. Here's an expected treatment response on the ORS. You see the yellow on the graph, and that's the kind of message you will get. Now, here's how it's calculated. And bear with me a minute. I know sometimes this language is kind of wacky, but the expected treatment response is just the average trajectory of everybody in the My Outcomes database that entered with that same intake score plus or minus 1. So that's what that average trajectory, or that expected treatment response, that's what we're hoping this client will achieve. Of course, it's great if they achieve more than that, but if they achieve less than that, we want to know. So this expected treatment response for each intake score results in a trajectory that you see on that graph. Now, for each session, there's an expected treatment score, right? So this ETR predicts a score at each session. So, for example, if you have an intake of 20, the ETR for session 2 is 23.5. That's what we hope the client will achieve. So what we do in this algorithm, or in this feedback message, is we look at the % of that expected change that the client has reached. And then I added to that whether or not I would be concerned as a clinician, if this client was going to take longer, would I be concerned at that level of change at this point? So they not only look at how much the client has achieved in relation to the target, it also looks at what makes good clinical common sense. So it doesn't denigrate slower change the clients might have, and it brings some clinical nuance in addition to the new algorithms. So that's what I was attempting to accomplish with the science of looking at longer-term treatment trajectories, and so that it would fit all clients rather than 75% of them, and so that the messages would be more friendly to the many kinds of different situations that clinicians encounter with their clients. So I hope that made sense. Thanks very much for your attention, and I'll turn it back over to Cindy.
Okay, so thank you, Barry. And now, if anyone had any questions, if they could put them into the chat, or or the questions box. I have a question for you, Barry.
Okay.
Can you talk about the differences in the slope of the trajectory between the old algorithms and the new? Some of the things that you noticed.
Yeah, first of all, noticed a lot more change in clients in the My Outcome database than the previous algorithms predicted. So it had also more change was predicted, but at the same time, a lesser slope, or not quite the steep jumps in the early sessions that the older trajectories displayed. Now, if you think about that, the older trajectories were based on 65,000 administrations of the measures. The initial trajectories were. So, this is a much larger data set, and so the prediction is far likely to be more accurate, a better guideline to go by. So if you're used to the old trajectories, you're going to notice these new ones are predicting more change for your clients. Along with that, the new analysis of that data brought the reliable change index on the ORS up to 6, increased from 5. So, that's another change that is significant. And that's just simply that new data set, the new standard deviation of the ORS at the first session, the different, combine that with the reliability of the measures, and it comes up with a new, it's just a formula that you stick those numbers into it, the first session, last session, standard deviation, you configure the standard error, and you factor in the reliability of the ORS, and then that gives you the reliable change index. And so that increased from 5 to 6. And if you look at, if you consider 19 to 20 being the average outpatient intake ORS score, and you're looking for at the 50th percentile or average trajectory of that person coming in with an intake of 19 or 20, you'll see that they change the reliable change index amount, and that's exactly the way it should look. By the way, Bill and I went through the data set at every intake score and figured the means and plotted those trajectories, and you know what? That provided a nice smell test for how the trajectories operate, and I'm very happy with how it all lines up with the descriptive data that came from the My Outcomes database, and also the linear regression equations, actually with a longitudinal multi-linear regression equation that configured into a cubic model, if you know anything about stats. So this is a far more sophisticated look at the data than the first set of algorithms were. Of course, there's nothing uncomplicated about linear regression equation, but I just wanted to tell you that this latest kind of pass of this data brought the very latest statistical methodology to understand these algorithms, and thanks to Michael Toland for that.
Okay, so we have another good question, Barry, and it's something we didn't cover, which is how do we switch from the shorter to long-term clients?
That happens automatically when it goes from 8 to 9 is my understanding of the way that would be programmed, that as soon as the client goes from 8 to 9, it'll switch their trajectory for the longer term.
That's right. That's right.
And so, your client will immediately then, if they're changing slower, you'll notice the messages aren't, they're not punitive or worrisome. They're only encouraging, if the client is changing still at 50% of what we're hoping they'll change, they're still on course. They just may be slower. And it's something worth talking about, with clients, about that. That we know that, what I like about this, it takes the clinical reality that we know for whatever reason that some clients take longer than others. Now, you can posit all kinds of psychopathological reasons for that, but the fact that remains is some clients take longer. And so how do we think about how they change in therapy is a question that I wanted to ponder and think about. And so with the My Outcomes database, we could actually look at that. That 427,000 administrations was 95,000 clients. So we could take a look at it, and that's ever growing, and we'll continue to look as that unfolds. But it allowed us to, examine that 1 in 4 that go on.
Okay, are you able to read the questions, Barry?
You know what? I moved away from my desk.
That's
I can
okay.
go back.
It's a long one. When working with teen clients, I have times that during family sessions, the parent is reporting significantly lower scores on the ORS than the teen has been reporting during their individual sessions. Of course, this becomes part of the clinical conversation, but why do you think the significant differences in scores happens?
Well, it's really what I would predict. I mean, that there would be difference in scores, different viewpoints. Oftentimes, kids are mandated to treatment. Mandated people tend to score the measures high. Again, not because they're lying or misrepresenting, because they are the ones that are not distressed about the problem. Kids are rarely distressed about the problems that parents drag them to therapy for. So, there's likely to be. Actually, I wouldn't say surprised, but, I'm mildly surprised when parents and kids' ratings are similar to one another, although it certainly happens. If you've seen my workshops, you know that I show both examples, when they're different and when they're together. So when they're different, like you say, I'm glad you added that to it. It provides, real good grist for talking about the difference and what needs to close, what can be done in session to close the differences, and what can happen both outside and inside of therapy that will allow the parent to view the kid more in line with the kid's view of him or herself. So that's the kind of discussion I want to have. But it's not surprising to me that when kids are rating themselves, they're not going to rate themselves at the same distress level that their parents viewing the kid will rate them. So I think that's the best explanation for that. Now, the thing that I find incredibly interesting, and we've seen in the data, is that when the ratings go up, even if kids' ratings start high, say the teenager's rating is 29 or 30, and the parent's rating is 15 or 16, what we notice is that when one score goes up, so does the other one. So there's a pretty strong correlation, in fact a significant one in our study, between parents' rating of change and the kids' rating of change. So while they may start off really different views, they both still will recognize change when it happens, which is, the whole idea, the whole purpose.
Okay, thank you. I've got one more. I'm going to take this one. It's from Bert, and it is, how will the transition work for existing clients? Basically, when you come to work on Monday morning after Saturday the 18th, Bert, all your clients will be in the new database, and as you enter their scores, they will be showing up with the new trajectories.
And so therefore also the new aggregate data analysis and all those kinds of things as well.
That's right, yeah. You're going to see a shift. Maybe, Barry, could you talk a little bit about that old corrected effect size?
Sure. The effect size is not near as complicated as you think it is. It really is just the difference of the means divided by the standard deviation of the measure. So, what you hear about the effect size in psychotherapy is that, traditionally it has an effect size of 0.80, right, 0.8. And that accounts for, you hear that psychotherapy is 4 times better than no treatment at all. So no treatment has an effect size of 0.2. So you have two groups, a treatment group and a non-treatment group. And the control group, you measure them at the end of things, and then of course you measure the change in the treatment group. And what you find is that the average treated person is 80% better off than the average untreated person. So that's where that comes from. So 0.8 effect size is how we think of psychotherapy, but we also think of the control group as a 0.2 effect size, right? So that's a good way to understand, effect size. Now, in the way my outcomes is presented before, uncorrected effect size is actually just a pre-post effect size. It's that same way. So it looks at all of the data aggregates it, right, and then it has an effect size that comes out of it. Actually, the effect size in my outcomes from that 427,000 administrations after the data was cleaned was 0.81. So it was right on the money of what typically psychotherapy, effectiveness is, and with a real clinical population. And the other thing good about that is that, my outcomes includes dropouts, or in other words, anybody that had 2 sessions or more were included. So it's pretty much a pure intent to treat sample, not like many effect sizes are only on completers. So 0.81 is pretty darn good. So that's your point of comparison on that uncorrected. Uncorrected is a pre-post effect size on the whole database without controlling for intake score. So then you get to the corrected effect size, and what that's doing is comparing your client, therapist, agency, entire aggregate to the effect size in the My Outcomes database, but corrected for intake score, which means it's an apples-to-apples comparison, a more specific comparison of how you're doing versus those intake scores in the My Outcomes. So anything positive on that is good, right? So anything, and actually if you're negative 0.1 up, you're doing fine because you're just right about the average effect size for the database in My Outcomes. It's with regard to the first effect size, that pre-post, if you're beaten better than no treatment, right? If you're better than 0.2, you're doing pretty well, right? So if you're 0.8, you're doing very well. You're kind of the same as the aggregate My Outcomes database. So, the effect sizes are good ways to be thinking about your change, to be thinking about how you're doing. It's just another one of those key performance indicators, along with your average change, and effect size is very important in figuring that out, as well as that % of your clients that are reaching target.
Okay, I've got another clinical question. In a college counseling center, students often start and stop counseling throughout the year for different problems. Is there a way to track the different treatment encounters rather than combining them in one trajectory?
Yes, there is. You'll have to help me on the My Outcomes part of this, but there's you could identify them as different encounters just by changing the way the client administers the same name but A, B, C in terms of the encounters, because you really wouldn't want them to be on the same trajectory. If it's a different treatment encounter, a different problem, or even if the client has been out of service for 6 to 9 weeks or what have you, it's pretty much a different encounter. So many things have intervened in the period that it would be hard to continue on that same trajectory. So I would encourage you to once the client's out of the system, that you make that client inactive, and you identify that client, in a series of encounters throughout the year, and maybe it would make sense just to put an A and then the next time a B, so you could identify in terms of temporally when the person came in, because it just doesn't make any sense to continue the trajectory when you're dealing with a different problem.
Right, and so in My Outcomes, you can close an episode of care, and then you can either reopen it. So if they came back a few weeks later for the same problem, you could either reopen that episode of care, or you could start a new episode of care with them. Okay, let me see. We got any more questions here? People are asking, will the slides be available online? Yeah, we'll send you both PowerPoints as well as a copy, a recording of the webinar, and we'll be sending that out to everyone, regardless of whether they registered for the webinar or not. And let's see. Oh, okay. I think this will be our last question. Is there an article, journal or other, that documents and explores this differential sense of short-term and long-term clients and different expected treatment responses and rate of change?
Yes. I'm working on that now in terms of this data set, but it's a ways from being submitted for publication, because there's so many other presses for that right now. But the Baldwin article that I spoke of, looks at different trajectories based on length of stay. So that would be a good place to start. Now, and it also, covers how many people in that data set. 77% of people attended 8 sessions or less, which, 91% in that data set by session 12. But for me, the main point about that was then still 1 in 4 people go longer. And what are we doing about those folks in terms of how we think about how they change? And was there a way to take that and apply it in an expected treatment response in my outcomes? But the Baldwin article is a good place to start, and I'm hoping to publish our thoughts about how we did this, because I think it could be helpful in looking at other data sets if they split it out that way. So, but there's nothing about this particular process that's published, although you can take a look at these PDF of the slides and glean a lot from that. But also that reference for Baldwin is in the slides as well.
Okay, so thank you, Barry. For the people who didn't get their questions answered, if they're questions for Barry, I'm sure you'd be happy to hear from them if they wanted to email you.
Sure, email me at barrylDuncan@comcast.net.
Yes, and for my outcomes, I think you know how to get a hold of us. And if you had any questions for me specifically, Cindy Hansen at myoutcomes.com. And thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to you experiencing my outcomes on the 18th if you haven't had a chance to get a sneak peek sooner. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Barry.
You're welcome. Good to be here. Take care.